Welcome to Two True Philosophy. I'm your host, the Thinking Man. With collapsing birth rates across the developed world, societies will increasingly struggle to maintain economic and social stability. Is it too true to handle that feminism is to blame for this decline? Or is it another symptom of a cost of living crisis?
Excuse me, I'm Karen from HR. I'm concerned that this video may promote outdated stereotypes, so I'm here to make sure that any comments or conclusions aren't sexist or misogynistic.
Thank you for joining us, Karen. Perhaps your input will help. Birth rates across the developed world are broadly heading in a downward direction, with many places at sub-replacement fertility levels below 2.1. This matters because 2 is the rate where every adult is replaced when they die, while the 0.1 gives an allowance for deaths within the population. 2.1 doesn't grow the population, but it does keep it stable. When it drops below this level, it begins to decline, and history shows that when this takes place, it never truly recovers. The only meaningful exception is the period after war, often accompanied by a baby boom, where birth rates increase dramatically, World War II being one example. The question is, what's causing this? Before looking at feminism, let's consider other possibilities. It's reasonable to suggest that economic factors contribute to lower birth rates, given that the rising cost of living means people can't afford to have children. What this means is that people delay having families until much later in life, and as a result, a growing number of people have one child or none. This has led to the DINK acronym being used to describe couples with dual income and no kids.
I'm going to have to interrupt because having a child is a personal choice. It's not something people should feel pressured into. That's why we stopped using judgmental terms like childless to describe people, especially women with no children. Child-free is a far more appropriate modern description.
No moral judgment has been made here, Karen. I'm merely showing that the rising cost of living is making it harder to have children.
And what would help is more support for women in the workplace or from the state, like subsidized childcare, longer maternity leave, and child tax credits.
Here we see the conundrum. What you're asking for must be funded directly through taxation or the cost of doing business. If the right balance isn't hit between policies and economic growth, it adds pressure to the rising cost of living. My previous videos on this channel showed that economic balance between free markets and socialist policies is essential to a prosperous society. Where this isn't achieved, economic growth will falter, leading to a death spiral of rising taxes and government debt. This causes declining GDP, or gross domestic product, the standard measure of growth in an economy. Economists call this decline stagflation, since you get the lethal combination of rising inflation and declining GDP at the same time.
Let me get this straight. You're saying that unless we chain women to the kitchen sink and turn them into baby-making factories, no one will have children because it'll be too expensive. Do you have any idea how misogynistic that is?
Again, you're attempting to frame my arguments as a moral judgment. What I'm doing is making a neutral argument showing that socialist policies will increase the cost of living if they aren't economically balanced. Failure to do this will make it harder to have children, unless you're relatively wealthy or you receive enough state welfare. There's certainly a discussion to be had about the balance between personal happiness and obligations to have children. Wherever you stand, a declining birth rate is going to cause significant problems for everyone in the future. But as you've shown, Karen, this crisis is often framed as misogyny by feminists.
What do you expect after centuries of male oppression? Women deserve far more than a life of being barefoot and pregnant. That's such a waste of their true potential.
It's clear that this is an emotional issue, but if we consider the difference between what is and what ought to be, this may help. In other words, whatever people think the world ought to be like, if it is a certain way, this limits how much we can change it. The economic policies you suggested for women, as well as the biological reality of the fertility rate, are 2 examples of this problem. Whatever ideology you introduce into this equation, you can only go so far without creating a crisis in the world around us.
Well, then you ought to consider that women in the workplace is positive for the economy because women sitting at home with children means they don't pay tax and don't contribute to GDP.
While on some level this may be true, as more women entered the workplace, it's led to increased demand for jobs, though not necessarily an increase in supply. This put downward pressure on wages due to demand for employment outweighing supply. The inverse relationship between supply and demand is something else I've previously covered on this channel and applies just as much to the job market. Free market advocates will often dismiss this with the counterclaim that economic growth will lead to more jobs, but this doesn't necessarily mean these jobs will pay well enough to support a family. To understand this, we need to make a distinction between two types of economic growth. GDP per capita measures economic growth once it's divided among the total number of people in the population, whereas aggregate GDP gives growth across the whole economy. It's therefore perfectly possible for aggregate GDP to show one picture, while GDP per capita shows that wealth on an individual level is lower. Aggregate GDP can also be artificially inflated by a few very wealthy people at the top, which is one reason why the disparity between aggregate and per capita GDP is important to consider. Likewise, negative economic factors can be hidden within GDP data that doesn't look at downward pressure on individual wages as more people enter the workforce. For example, over the last few decades, rising demand in employment has allowed businesses to suppress wage growth due to increased competition in the jobs market. This is good for people running businesses, but this is one reason why the average income cannot support a family anymore. This contributes heavily to a phenomenon known as the two-income trap, where a household now depends on two incomes to support a family rather than one. It's important to note that there was never truly a time when women didn't work, but in the past it was accepted that, when children were young, they took care of their children at home as the father worked to support the family. Whereas feminists have framed this as an oppressive situation that held women back, decades later we can see that one average income supporting a family is a luxury we no longer have.
I can't believe you actually think that more women working has caused the average wage to decline. You really will say anything to make us go back to the Stone Age, won't you?
Let me remind you, Karen, of the is-ought problem. That being said, I do think I've made enough observations to draw some uncomfortable conclusions about feminism when it comes to collapsing birth rates. It's clear that the hostility feminism has towards women raising children at home has created problems within the economy, and that these problems are rooted in the same issues as socialist economics. Policies feminists argue for have strongly contributed to a rapid rise in the welfare state and substantial costs in doing business. This increases taxes and national debt, which in turn put pressure on the cost of living. All this makes having children much harder, so it's no surprise that the birth rate is declining so much. Finally, if feminism was genuinely concerned about family life, not to mention meaningful equality between the sexes, a very different working arrangement would have been encouraged by feminists over the last few decades. Rather than normalizing both parents going out to work, feminists could have encouraged both parents to work part-time, so the benefits of working and spending time with children could be shared without suppressing wage growth in the jobs market.
Why would feminism concern itself with anything that benefits men? Feminism is only interested in what benefits women. Besides, families with men and women are just a throwback to antiquated patriarchal norms. Women being independent from men is what matters, not a sustainable birth rate.
And here we see that feminism does indeed contribute to collapsing birth rates due to prevailing attitudes about motherhood and female happiness. While there are other factors that made the birth rate decline over time, feminism is certainly a significant starting point. The true tragedy is that if women had been encouraged to work alongside men rather than compete with them, it would be far more likely that one average wage could support a family today. What we do now that the birth rate has fallen to such unsustainable levels seems impossible to resolve while there is so much hostility to family life. Let me know what you think in the comments section, and if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe.